class, Prof JC, and this week I actually appreciate the chapter that we're going to look at here in our book, which is chapter 7, and the title of the chapter is CQ Action, Be Yourself, Sort of. And I actually appreciate that, and I appreciate what they're talking about here. What this chapter is talking about is the ability to adapt when you're in different circumstances. Again, this entire class is on cultural intelligence. Some of what we're talking about today has to do with what I would call emotional intelligence, but it really hones in terms of when we're in different cultural settings, how we need to act. But it doesn't just mean in different countries. It also means right here in the United States, understanding the culture of the organization that you're speaking to, the culture of the team, the history, the traditions. They give a great example in this chapter about a gentleman who comes out of the business sector, goes into the higher ed sector, okay, and works for a university, and he brings in kind of his business knowledge from business and how to grow businesses and how to turn things around and the bottom line. And he brings that into a higher ed setting where, if you know anything about higher ed settings, and obviously all of us are in a higher ed setting, but if you've ever worked for a higher ed setting, the rules are just much different in higher ed. I am lucky enough to work for a business school, so we tend to think a little bit more like business because we have a lot of relationships with business, and a lot of our professors come out of industry. So we tend to move faster in the business school. We tend to think more like business. But higher ed in general, a university in general, does not typically think from a business perspective. So this gentleman in here, I've seen that at Point Loma, and you've probably seen it at institutions where you've been as well. So this gentleman here, he's coming in to lead a university, but he's taking his business knowledge, and it just isn't resonating with the faculty and the staff of this university because they just think differently, right? We tend to think in terms of year-long, right, initiatives, right? Things may not happen in the next 2 to 3 months. It might take an entire year to make happen. We tend to think in terms, if the for-profit world tends to think in quarters, right? Higher ed tends to think in terms of academic years. And so it's just different. So the examples that this book is talking about are really important for us, and they're not just about race and religion and socioeconomic status, although some of that can be the case, but it also has to do with understanding the culture of the organization where you're at and learning how to speak within that culture. I had a similar story in my own kind of journey. This was years ago. I'd come out of working in ministry in evangelical churches. So in evangelical churches, it's just they move differently in terms of how they work. It probably is the most, and there's a word I'm looking for, most casual environment that you could be in is an evangelical church if you've ever worked for a church. And again, when I say church, I mean evangelical church. If you've ever worked in a church, but it's more of a higher church, maybe a Methodist or something along those lines, it's going to be a little bit different. But evangelical churches, which tend to be more non-denominational, you get Southern Baptist. I guess you can have some Methodist in there as well. But they're just much more casual. They're casual on Sundays. And if you've probably seen some of them, some of the pastors get up on their platforms and they teach and they're in sandals, right? Which just blows my mind. But they might be in sandals and a t-shirt and jeans or something like that. It's even more casual during the week, if you can imagine that. And so I came out of that background, and you would use words in staff meetings. You would use words like awesome or cool, or it's been a while since I've been out, so I can't remember some of the words that we would use, but awesome would be one of them. And you'd have several other words that you would use, which weren't a big deal, right? I'm just trying to think of other terms and terminology, but I've been out of that world long enough that I kind of forget. But anyway, I transitioned from that, and then I worked for, it was a nonprofit that dealt with foster care. And so our job was to recruit foster parents, and then we do these info sessions at this place. And then out of the info sessions, hopefully some of them would stick and they would want to become foster parents. And then our job was to kind of work them through uh, to become foster parents. So I started giving some of the info sessions, and I found myself talking like I would if I were in an evangelical setting, very casual, and I said the word awesome quite a bit, and I said some other things quite a bit, and then I found uh, afterwards, I did a debrief with my boss at the time, and I just said, what could I have done? What did I do well? What could I have done better? Or that was the conversation we had. I don't know if I asked those questions, but that was one of the things that she pointed out is she said, JC, when I hear you speak, when I hear you talk, you use a lot of these words that we just don't use here. And I'm guessing these words were okay where you came from, but they're not going to work here. And so she really challenged me to change up how I spoke and to become much more conscious about how I approached the world and how I approached professional people, and using words like awesome and all the other words that I had used before, which were fine in that setting. They were not fine in this setting. And so again, it was a lesson where I had to learn the culture of this new kind of world that I was in, and just understanding the culture of the other place that I came out of, which that there's nothing wrong with either. You just have to know where you're at. Okay. But the same could also be said if you, and I was talking about this with some people just maybe just a few days ago. If you come from a situation where maybe you're in an institution of higher ed, okay, we use the example that we used before, and there's a certain way of speaking there, a certain way of talking there, and then maybe you come down and you're speaking to a group of youth, a group of teens in maybe a lower income neighborhood or something like that. And I've worked in some of those places here in San Diego. I probably, excuse me, I probably would not use the same kind of language and patterns that I would use in higher ed or in business in this world over here. Okay. And so and none of these worlds are wrong, right? It's understanding the culture. This book goes a little bit deeper, obviously, and talks about it's not just the culture of the businesses, but it's also literally when you go into different countries, there's different ways. And so this chapter, which is chapter 7, is the one that I'm referring to. It gives several different examples about, okay, go ahead and be yourself, but it really talks about the importance of adapting your communication. Okay. And it says here on page 158, whether casting vision, building trust, giving directions, or addressing conflict, a great deal centers around whether we can get the message across effectively, clearly, and respectively. Communication is not about saying the right thing. It's about the right thing being understood. Nearly every book on leadership includes a section on the importance of communication. For me, and then it gives the example of Simon, who was what I just told you about, was a great example of a person who came out of business, went to work for higher ed, and couldn't understand why is it that his words weren't resonating with the faculty and staff. Well, they don't have a business mindset. They're not thinking from there. They're thinking from a higher ed perspective. So it just talks about the importance of adapting your communication. It talks about word usage, topics, certain requests that you're going to make, apologies that you make, right, are going to be different in different cultures, compliments that you give, delivery, nonverbal actions, distance, gestures, facial expressions, body position, eye contact, right? All of this stuff is going to be different. So here's what I want to ask you to do. I want to ask you to dive into chapter 7, and this is required reading, so it's a required book, so you should have the book. And I want you to find one of the ways in chapter 7 that it talks about needing to adapt your communication. And then I want you to write about maybe that way, maybe there was something that you've done before and you've now learned that you have to adapt your communication in a different way. Okay. So again, just go to chapter 7. It gives you several different ways that we need to learn how to adapt our communication. Pick one of the ways that it talks about, and then write out from your perspective, has there been a way that you've had to adapt your communication? I just gave you an example of mine. And then that'll be your work for the week. Okay. All right. And again, the most important thing is not just to write about this, but then to do it. Okay. And just be consistently. We talked about this last week. This book and what we're talking about really it's just about awareness. It's raising awareness. So to be consistently aware of your surroundings and learning how to adapt yourself so that you can lead effectively in different surroundings. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you in next week's podcast as we dive into chapter 8 next week. And I look forward to reading your responses. Take care. Reach out if you need it.